Good morning. I'm Lawrence Weschler, the Artistic Director of the festival, and we'll start the program in just a moment. I just wanted to take note, especially in this room, where he was such a presence, of the passing yesterday of Studs Terkel. He was such a presence at the festival, and I'm struck today thinking about last year, how we had scheduled Grace Paley to be one of the presenters, and she had died just before she could present, and we instead did a celebration of Grace, and Studs was the first person there celebrating Grace. Yes, we were together all those years. And she did this story, The Loudest Voice. It was about a little girl. She wants to. Anyway, it's strange, that this festival takes its name, thinking big, from next year being the 100th year of the Burnham Plan, and the plan for the city of Chicago. And Burnham famously said, "Make no little plans." 3 years after saying that, little Studs Terkel was born here and moved here to Chicago shortly after that, 96 years old. It's been noted that how sad it is that he didn't live to see the election on Tuesday, an election which stood for, in many ways, everything he believed his entire life, but over 96 years, Studs carried the torch. And I just want to say that from here on out, the rest of this festival is dedicated not to the memory of Studs, but is a celebration of Studs. So thank you all for being here. And now on with the program.
Good morning. I would like to welcome you to the 2008 edition of the Chicago Humanities Festival. My name is Tina Cervone. As the director of the Italian Cultural Institute in Chicago, I would like to thank the Chicago Humanities Festival for renewing its collaboration. In particular, I wish to thank the Chicago Humanities Festival Charter Humanist Circle for its significant support in this year's festival. It is my pleasure to welcome Professor Adriano La Regina, who is one of the leading personalities in the field of archaeology, for his vast experience, and I am proud that he is here representing Italy on this important occasion. Adriano La Regina lives in Rome, where he is professor in the Department of Archaeology at the University of Rome La Sapienza. He has been superintendent of antiquities for the city of Rome for about 30 years. In this capacity, he carried out numerous restructuring projects of Rome's most famous buildings and monuments, such as the Roman National Museum, the Palazzo Altem, and the Crypta Balbi, only to mention some. He promoted the restoration of Rome's most treasured monuments, greatly damaged by the surrounding pollution, such as the arches of Tito, Costantino, Appian Way, the Colosseum, the Roman Forum, the Palatine, and the Domus Aurea. Professor La Regina has served as president of the National Institute of Archaeology and Art History since 2004, and of the Parco della Via Appia since 2007. He will speak about the Roman road system and monuments which were essential for the growth of the Roman Empire, aspects which were an example for other countries and civilization. Thank you for joining me in welcoming Professor La Regina.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It is for me a pleasure and a great privilege to be here. I would like to thank the Chicago Humanities Festival for the invitation, and also the Istituto Italiano di Cultura for its partnership to this presentation. And I thank you all for your kind consideration and for being here this morning. The theme of this festival, an exhortation toward magnanimous thoughts, introduces us easily to the subject of the ancient world, and in particular to the meaning taken by the monuments of Rome through different ages. When antiquity occurs in our mind, it is often related to greatness, magnanimity, monumentality, excellence of literature, philosophy, art, architecture, but also of ideals, of daring undertakings. Take, for example, Alexander the Great. If we consider why he was great, we find an obvious answer in his victories over the Persian Empire and in his audacious conquest driven to the edge of the world. On a Roman road map, near the eastern limit of the world, there is an annotation. Hic Alexander responsum accepit. Here, Alexander was given the oracular reply. Usque quo Alexander? How far, Alexander? How far, Alexander? Meaning that he had dared too much and that no advancement was allowed beyond that point. The words were inscribed near two square altars, symbol of a boundary, in this case of the conquered world. Not far from a city recorded on a map with the name of Alexandria Escate, the farthest, founded by Alexander. His conquest reached the boundaries of China, and even if it did not last for a long time, even if they did not last for a long time, they established for the first time direct relations with the Far East. On the same way, later on, the Silk Road would have steadily opened trade connections between the Roman and the Chinese empires. The map is a medieval copy of an ancient parchment scroll, long 22 feet and high just 13 inches, so that it cannot give a geographical representation, but only a conventional description of all the roads with distances between stations and cities of the Roman Empire as far beyond its northern and eastern boundaries. Constantinople is depicted as the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. The pride of the Greeks of Alexandria, of Antioch, of Seleucia, of Media, and of Persia, aware of the greatness of the world born from the fusion of Hellenic culture with that of the Orient, was the true inheritance of Alexander. We can find a fine modern interpretation of this sentiment in the verses of the poet Constantine Cavafis, himself a Greek of Alexandria. For centuries, imagination of antiquity has been related to greatness, but greatness implies decay, and ruins arouse nostalgic feelings among posterity. In the Middle Ages, the remains of ancient monuments of Rome were a tangible evidence of a lost magnificence. Quanta Roma fuit, ipsa ruina docet. How great was Rome, it is shown by its ruins. This conception goes back at least to the 12th century to a French learned bishop, Hildebert of Laverdun. The impressive remains of the Palace of the Caesars on the Palatine Hill attracted for centuries the interest of architects and painters. One of the oldest pictures of this kind was drawn in 1594 by Simone del Pollaiolo, an architect from Florence. It depicts the western slope of the Palatine Hill toward the Circus Maximus, with the ruins not yet excavated. Simone was surnamed Chronicle, for his habit of describing with exact precision by words and not only through his drawings ancient monuments of Rome. The drawing shows that the palace was then in conditions not much different from the present status. The main difference is that nowadays the ruins of the imperial residence, which occupied almost all the hill, have been largely excavated, while the Circus Maximus has not yet been unearthed, except for minor portions. Since then, these ruins have been drawn so many times by artists coming from every part of Europe that every major change in their conditions has been recorded. The southeast corner of the palace appears, for example, in a drawing of the year 1535 by Mertens van Heemskerk, a Dutch painter to whom we owe also many information on ancient monuments no more existing. Here he is represented in a self-portrait of 1553 with the Colosseum. The same view of the palace was drawn in 1575 by Etienne Dupeyrac, a French artist and architect who became librarian of Cardinal Alessandro Farnese. He completed the Grand Gallery of the Louvre. And once more, we have a same view of the southwestern corner of the Palatine Hill drawn in the year 1606 by Gilles Sadeler, a Flemish engraver. The present condition of that area of the palace are still as they were represented centuries ago. We know that the artists who drew or painted images of ruins were moved by admiration of antiquity and in the same time by regret for destructions, even if often their main interest was roused by the effort of learning from the ancients, for them unrivaled in their greatness. The regret for the lost greatness of Rome is signified by the words inscribed on an ancient altar in the year 1500, Cardinal Julian Cesarini erected for the sake of its elegance this stone which survived the ruin of Rome. The same feeling is expressed by Raphael in a famous letter to Pope Leo X, where he maintains that modern architecture, he refers to, naturally, to 15th and early 16th century style, that modern architecture was second only to the ancient, while the buildings of the Middle Ages were without measure and grace. The role of Raphael in a rediscovery of antiquity needs not to be treated here. I would like only to mention his interest for a very particular monument, the Domus Aurea, the Golden House of Nero, whose discovery so much influenced the painting of the Italian Renaissance. He used to go, as many other painters did, into the subterranean rooms, almost completely filled by earth, reaching them through holes in the ceiling at the light of torches and to look at close range to the painted vaults. The Domus Aurea, the Golden House of Nero, was an amazing building, erected by Nero after the great fire of the year AD 64. It was not yet finished in AD 68 when he died. It has been the most daring architectural undertaking of ancient Rome. Nero enlarged the imperial palace of the Palatine Hill, adding to it the Velia, the Cillian Hill, the Appian Hill, and the depressed area where later the Colosseum would have been built. In this way, the imperial seat occupied great part of the city of Rome. And people naturally were not glad for that. The Golden House of Nero was named as such by Nero for its splendor. Domus Aurea is the translation into Latin of the Greek domos Chrysios, the golden house of Zeus, so named by Sappho, the golden celestial houses of the gods for Pindar, and also the golden astral houses of the gods for Euripides. With this name, Golden House, Nero was introducing in Rome the notion of a divine residence for imperial power. Seneca, the teacher of the young Nero and counselor of the emperor, suggested to him the divine model. You are not allowed to hide, just as the sun is not. When you appear into sight of the public, you are a rising aster. The pavilion of the Appian Hill, the Golden House, survived Nero for 35 years, until the architect Apollodorus of Damascus built upon it the baths of Trajan, which submerged the entire building and somehow saved it for us. Buried underground, the palace remained hidden and was only rediscovered in the 15th century. Fully preserved, with most of its wall paintings, excavations from the mid of the 18th century began to free the rooms from the earth, and a complex of 150 rooms have been so far recovered. Since the building has a symmetrical plan, it may be calculated that another great number of rooms, at least 100, are still buried. The superimposition of the Trajan baths, foundations in dark red here on the map, does not allow to perceive the role played by the light within the palace. All the rooms were fully exposed to the sun through windows or large passageways. So this is the western portion of the Domus Aurea, and you may see the Neronian walls are in yellow, and the red ones are of the age of Trajan. The most original feature of the pavilion is the plan, especially in the eastern part, where there is the center of the building. The farthest part of on the right has not yet been excavated, with the octagonal room, the biggest of all the complex. The pavilion was not a residential part of the imperial palace. Passageways were open, without doors, and there was no heating. The plan itself shows no character of a residence, as the palace on the Palatine Hill. Too many rooms have niches for statues and are exposed to full light. Others were conceived for a central focus. Others are small and open to internal itineraries. There have been many interpretations for the function of this building, but none of them seems to me satisfactory. I believe that the pavilion was planned for exhibition of works of art and of precious objects. That is, it was a real museum. We know that Nero plundered famous works of art in cities and sanctuaries all over Greece. We know from the word of Pliny that most of them were exposed in the Domus Aurea, and we must think that he meant just the special building of the Palace of Nero, this special building of the palace, and not the palace in general. In one of the main rooms, it must have been exposed the Laocoon of the Vatican Museum, found in the Appian Hill in the year 1506. It had probably been moved from the Golden House to the Baths of Trajan, so on the upper floor, after the Domus Aurea, the Golden House, had been abandoned. After the death of Nero, many of the sculptures and paintings he had collected there were moved by Vespasian to the Temple of Peace, which became thus a public museum, and no more a private collection of the prince. Vespasian dismantled the huge imperial residence, which had occupied great part of the center of Rome, and gave it back to the public. In a large depression in front of the Domus Aurea, where Nero had made a lake, the Stagnum Neronis, he built the amphitheater, the Colosseum, and near the Forum, he built the Temple of Peace. The cost of both buildings was borne with the treasure of Jerusalem. The triumph for the victories of the Judaic War was represented on the Arch of Titus. A recently found inscription proves that the Colosseum was in fact completed by Titus ex manubis, that is, with the money obtained from the booty of Jerusalem. In the central room of the pavilion, the octagonal room, there was certainly an important group of sculptures, and this must have been a bronze triumphal monument originally exposed in the precinct of the Athena Polias on the Acropolis of Pergamon to celebrate the defeat of the Galatians, the Gauls of the East, by Attalus I, king of Pergamon. Nero moved the group to Rome to adorn the Domus Aurea. We know this by Pliny. The originals, the bronze statues, are lost, but we have marble copies of them, two sculptures belonging to that group found in the Orti Sallustiani, a villa owned by Julius Caesar just outside the Republican walls of Rome, between the Via Salaria and Via Nomentana. One is the Gaul killing himself and his wife, now in the Roman National Museum. The other one is the dying Gaul of the Capitoline Museums. The marble copy of the Gauls was certainly a gift given to Caesar after his victories in the Gallic Wars. It is interesting that the sculptures were not exposed by him to the public, but taken into a private possession. There is perhaps a reason for this. The victory of the year 230 on the Gauls or the Galatians in Asia had been the legitimation of royalty for Attalus I, who 8 years before had crowned himself king of Pergamon. After the victory, he took also the name of Soter, savior. So Caesar, who was blamed for royal ambitions, could not leave room to suspicions with the exposition of a Gallic triumphal monument copy of that of Pergamon. But the Golden House has also its own wall decoration. In the main rooms, painted by famous artists whose names have been recorded by ancient authors, Fabulus, to him we must attribute the paintings of the Gilded Vault, admired and copied by painters who introduced themselves in that room through holes in the ceiling. We still have several copies of these paintings, such as those drawn in the year 1538 by Francisco de Holanda, a Portuguese painter with a deep interest in antiquity and a friend of Michelangelo, of whom he painted a portrait. A complex system of decoration of the Gilded Vault included rounds with figure scenes. At the center of the vault is depicted the rape of Ganymedes. Fabulus must have painted mostly scenes with figures, such as those in the room of Achilles at Skyros, but also the decorations that surrounded them in the main rooms of the palace. Pliny describes him in his natural history. The painter Fabulus lived a short while ago, grave and severe, and at the same time florid and humid. The Minerva of his work, clearly a famous work now lost, which looked at the spectator from whatever direction he observed it. He painted only a few hours a day, but this solemnity. He always dressed a toga, even on the scaffolding. The Domus Aurea was like the prison of his art. Outside, he did not do much work. These are the words of Pliny. It belongs to him the powerful composition of the scenes depicting Achilles at Skyros. Achilles, hidden at Skyros among the daughters of King Lycomedes, leaves his female clothes aside and chooses the weapons from the gifts brought by Ulysses, thus betraying his identity. In this room, as in others painted by Fabulus, such as the room of Hector and Andromache, we find the highest level of that kind of decorative system that was defined grotesque by artists of the Renaissance. They went into the underground grottos and copied the decoration of the vaults. Benvenuto Cellini, in his autobiography, says, "These grotesques were named as such by contemporary because they were found in certain caverns of the earth, which in antiquity were rooms, ovens, studios, halls, and other things like this. Many of the artists who visited the Domus Aurea signed their names, traced in soot of the torches on the walls, or scratched on the color of the painted walls. Others may be identified through their drawings of decorative motifs." So we know, for example, that the entire group of painters called to Rome in the year 1480 by Sixtus IV to decorate the Sistine Chapel, such as Perugino, Filippino Lippi, Ghirlandaio, and Pinturicchio, used to explore with torchlights the mysterious and fascinating painted rooms of the Domus Aurea. Ghirlandaio signed in the room of Hector and Andromache. Pinturicchio signed scratching his name on the paintings of the room of the Yellow Vault in the western part of the palace. And we may find in the works of these painters many details that show their dependence from decorative motifs of the Golden House. But the fullest agreement of style and tastes with the wall paintings of the Domus Aurea comes from Raphael's workshop, and in particular with the work of Giovanni da Udine. Vasari tells that Raphael was first taken to visit the Domus Aurea by Giovanni da Udine, of whom we may see here a detail of the wall decoration in the Logge Vaticane, the Vatican arcades. When we admire the monumental ruins of the palace of the Caesars, it is not easy to conceive, even with the most fervid fantasy, the image of what it looked like in its original conditions. Ruins give a powerful image of how space was captured by ancient architects, monumentality deprived of decoration, colorless and nude, without revetment marbles, stuccos, paintings, and precious stones, of which we have examples in the remains of the Domus Transitoria, the first palace of Nero before the fire of AD 64, easily leads our thoughts to greatness and to ineluctability of decay, and rouse sad feelings of regret for a disappeared world. In front of the bare ruins of the palace of the Caesars, the best way to imagine what it was, and this is what I suggest to anybody who asks me that, the best way is to visit the apostolic palaces of the Vatican. There we have a living example of how rediscovery of ancient monuments, knowledge of classical culture, and artistic genius allowed the painters and architects of the Renaissance to reproduce and sometimes also to surpass the lost greatness of antiquity. Sure, they did not know and could have not believed it, but in some cases they also surpassed the world they wanted to reproduce in the modern age. They already called it their age with this word, the modern age. We may say now that Raphael, perhaps the greater painters of all ages, but we lost the great Greek paintings, so we don't know for sure. Raphael was certainly not second to Fabulus, the painter of the house of Nero, whom he admired and imitated. His workshop, especially with Giovanni da Udine, but also with Perrin del Vega and Giulio Romano, adopted grotesque decorations to cover entire walls as the Logge Vaticane, the arcade on the second floor of the Vatican palaces, completed in 1519. The first example of a room completely designed and decorated as an ancient building is the stove or heated bathroom of the Vatican apartments of Cardinal Bibbiena, painted by Giovanni da Udine around the year 1514, a project that is, as it seems, by Raphael himself. On the painted walls of the Domus Aurea, there are signatures of artists who visited it through the 16th century. The ruins were not anymore visited in the 17th century, and only in the following century there was a new interest for its painting, and we may see it from drawings and engravings. The same feeling of admiration and nostalgia by Raphael, expressed by Raphael, aroused by the ruins of ancient Rome in Johann Wolfgang Goethe during his visit to the Appian Way. Diese Menschen arbeiteten für die Ewigkeit. These men worked for eternity. All causes of decay were calculated except the rage of the spoiler, which nothing can resist. He wrote these words on his notebook, later published with the title Italian Journey, Italienische Reise, on November 11th, 1786. He then goes on. Yesterday, I visited the nymph Egeria and then the hippodrome of Caracalla, the ruined tombs along the Via Appia, and the tomb of Metella, which is the first to give one a true idea of what solid masonry really is. The remains of the principal aqueducts are highly venerable. How beautiful, and a grand design to supply a whole people with water by so vast a structure. In the evening, we came upon the Colosseum when it was already twilight. When one looks at it, all else seems little. The edifice is so vast that one cannot hold the image of it in one's soul. In memory, we think it smaller, and then return to it again and find it every time greater than before. Some of the monuments Goethe mentions were wrongly identified at the time, but that does not matter. They are clearly recognizable. We may follow today the same itinerary and still find sites and monuments often in drawing, etchings, and paintings of the 18th and 19th centuries. The funeral monument of the Scipions is an underground sepulchral room with the sarcophagus of Lucius Cornelius Scipio Barbatus, the conqueror of Samnium and Lucania, at the beginning of the 3rd century BC, now in the Vatican Museum. The countryside along the Appian Way inspired artists and poets. It still keeps the same fascinating features. The straight road with its endless sequence of remains creates a fantastic scenery. The fate of ruinous offenses deriving from time, from intentional destructions, from transformations for new uses, created unpredictable architectural shapes. The ruins belong mostly to sepulchral monuments. Sometimes we know their ancient owners through inscriptions or literary sources, but more often they are anonymous. Destiny played a strange role in giving immortal memory or in condemning to oblivion. To the power family of the Cecili Metelli belonged a woman who had the privilege of an imposing monument on the Appian Way. The inscription reveals her name, Caecilia, Cecilia, daughter of Metellus Creticus and wife of Crassus. The Metelli had been, through the Republic, consuls and commanders for generations. They had military power during the First Punic War, and one of them subjugated Macedonia in 148 BC, and fought against Jugurtha in 109 BC, and the father of Cecilia, Quintus Caecilius Metellus, was consul in 69 BC. A few years later, he defeated a pirate fleet and conquered Crete. He earned, therefore, the name of Creticus. It is well known, the salacious verse that the poet Naevius dared to write about the Metelli. Fato Metelli Rome fiunt consules, for the fate, but these words could be a good or a bad fate in Latin, for the fate of Rome, the Metelli become consuls. And it is known also the reply, lacking of ambiguity, malum dabut Metelli naevio poetai. The Metelli will damage the poet Naevius, and in fact they did. The Lecchini Crassi were also a power and wealthy family. The husband of Caecilia must have been Marcus Licinius Crassus, the son of the commander who defeated the gladiators led by Spartacus in 72 BC, and a follower of Caesar in Gaul. We miss information about Cecilia Metella. Her monument is the only testimony of a woman whose face is for us hidden. Why did she deserve such a magnificent monument? Maybe she was a powerful lady, skilled in political intrigue and in the art of poisoning. Or otherwise, she was just a sweet and beloved wife. We'll never know it. This is another monument, Casal Rotondo. It's even bigger than Cecilia Metella. And let's the aqueducts of Rome in landscape. Another extraordinary architectural complex, which always marked the landscape of the Appian Way, is the villa of the Quintili family, later an imperial suburban residence located at the 5th mile from the center of Rome. Earlier, the site belonged to Pomponius Atticus, the friend of Cicero, who was in fact buried along the Appian Way just near the entrance of the villa. It belonged to two friends, the Quintili, that Commodus, the son of Marcus Aurelius, and then Commodus put them to death around the year 183 and seized the villa. That became his favorite residence. Also, later on, the property remained in the hands of the imperial family. The ruins of the villa were drawn, among others, by Carlo Labruzzi, a landscape painter active at the end of the 18th century. The Villa of the Quintili became a real imperial palace with huge structures and for public and private use of the emperor. An open square like a forum, monumental baths with a calidarium and a frigidarium, richly adorned with precious marbles and statues and big cisterns. These buildings were added to the villa by Commodus, the Emperor Commodus, whose interest for baths was well known. He even used to dine in the monumental rooms of the bath. The villa is another particular building added by Commodus, an amphitheater, certainly used not only for private gladiator games and staged animal hunts given there, but also for personal performances of the emperor, who used to participate to duels with gladiators, as we have seen in the picture, the gladiator. The villa, as modified by Commodus, is an architectural portrait of the emperor. Baths occupy a large portion of the complex with calidarium, tepidarium, frigidarium. The amphitheater, you may see here the round building, is the biggest building, and there was a circus for chariot also. Not theaters or music halls at all, as we find in other imperial residences. We have seen the admiration and nostalgia for lost greatness of what has always been felt by modern culture as regard to the monuments of ancient Rome. But let's now consider the question from another point of view. Did the ancient also feel amazement and surprise for monumental Rome? Rome was the capital of the empire, which lasted for centuries, and her greatness was somehow taken for granted. Nevertheless, wonder and astonishment were felt. If I may bring a personal experience for comparison, for a small comparison, I must say that when I was a young boy at 17, and for the first time I landed from a ship in the port of New York City, although that landscape was familiar to me through photographs and movies, that monumentality was not unexpected. I felt anyhow a strong astonishment for dimensions of space and buildings. It will be sufficient to recall here an interesting testimony of Ammianus Marcellinus, a writer of the 1st century AD, who gives a vivid picture of the surprise of the emperor Constantius during his visit to Rome in AD 356. He ruled in the eastern part of the empire. And here we may see some aerial pictures of what he saw and describes the Pantheon. The Theatre of Marcellus, of Pompeii, the Stadium of Domitian, which is now Piazza Navona. But when he came to the Forum of Trajan, a construction unique under the heavens, he stood fast in amazement, turning his attention to the gigantic complex about him. The Forum of Trajan was built by the architect Apollodorus of Damascus, a great personality of artist and engineer who gave to Rome no less than what would have given later Michelangelo. He built the Pantheon, the best of Trajan, and his greatest work, the Trajan Forum, with this historiated column. Now we may see some images of the column of Trajan, and machines depicted on the column, the emperor, and also a reconstruction of the colors of the column. So after this brief survey, as we see that astonishment and admiration were constant feelings through the ages for ancient magnificence, and that monumentality was one of the features in which it was recognized the greatness of Rome. Certainly, wealth was the result of supremacy and power. Monumentality was their representation. Many of the monuments we have mentioned were built to celebrate triumphs on subjugated peoples, Dacians, Germans, Parthians, the Judaic people, and many others. Domination, it always happens, was idealized in the name of peace. The defeat of opponents and the take of uncontrolled power in Rome was celebrated by Augustus with the Arapacis, the altar of peace. The temple of peace of Vespasian was the celebration of the defeat of Judea. Ideals of power were exalted and sublimated by art and poetry, by Horace with the Carmen Seculare, and by Virgil. Romans, be sure to dominate with power to impose peace. We have seen how dreadful has been the resumption of similar ideas in the first half of the past century. And more, admiration for technical accomplishments often overshadows the real significance of monuments. Take the Colosseum, for example, an astonishing example of great architecture and engineering of the ancients. But that building has meant for centuries death as performance, suffering for the fun of spectators, which is for us an abominable crime. Nevertheless, if we try to understand how it was possible for a small and insignificant Latin community established on the site of Rome around the 10th century BC to conceive and obtain growth, development, and power on other surrounding communities, we may find an answer in a strategy adopted for centuries. The Roman world was an open society, open to ethnic integration of incoming communities, open to social mobility among classes, open to adoption of foreign cultural patterns in any field, institutional, religious, literary, artistic, military, and so on. The history of Rome is the history of an everlasting meeting of cultures since its beginning. When the city was founded in the 8th century BC, it was populated by Latins already settled in the area and by Sabines. The rape of the Sabine women is the legendary representation of the birth of a new community from the fusion of two different peoples. Numa Pompilius, the second king of Rome, was the first one, and the first historical king. Romulus was in fact legendary, was a Sabine aristocrat. Etruscans also lived in Rome and were included into the Roman citizenship. The last three kings of Rome were in fact Etruscan, and among these, the greatest one, Servius Tullius. Meeting between peoples have always had a transformational effect on culture, as well as on technical and scientific accomplishments, integration and reciprocal comprehension. Meetings between cultures have produced an acceleration in the evolution of economic and social conditions. As such, they have been motors of development, determining events and changing the course of history. So how can today's world hope to be able to control phenomena that have always been with it, with their positive effects and their perverse deviations? The solution cannot be found in the past. It isn't there in history. It can only be found in our own aspirations, in the imagination of the future, of our ability to choose a way of being. These hopes and fears, born in the present, orient our research into the past. And in the past, we can find examples of specific experiences, of strategies, and of results obtained in this or that particular cultural, political, economic, and social context. But we will not find any certainties to inform our own behavior. Thank you. If there is any question?
Hello. Buongiorno. Could you speak a little about the Pantheon, and have they ever determined what materials were used in the ceiling, how it was constructed?
Oh, well, naturally, the vault is made of concrete and also with amphoras and empty vases inside, so that the vault would be light, not very heavy.
Is it true that the Romans got the idea for concrete from the Etruscans?
Excuse me, that the Romans copied?
Did the Romans get the idea for concrete from the Etruscans?
No, certainly not. The idea of concrete was born rather later in Roman architecture, and it was used especially after great victories in the Mediterranean area, because earlier, but let's see, the Greek technique for building of architecture is made of worked stones, marbles cut, and that required a very refined art of people skilled in working the stone and sculpturing it. Beginning at the beginning of the second century BC, a huge amount of slaves arrived to Rome, and this, well, they were war prisoners, naturally, and they were not all sent to the amphitheaters to be gladiators. The greatest part of them was used in building activities, and so it was found that unskilled people in building could anyhow be useful in working the concrete. And this is the reason why a huge amount of workers who were previously soldiers or anyhow were not skilled in building could have been used for this new kind of technique in Roman architecture.
What were some of the methods used in preserving monuments from present-day pollution?
Oh, naturally, pollution is the worst enemy we have today for marble, because marble turns into chalk, and so it loses the surface. And in very few years, we had huge damages to the surface of sculptured monuments of Rome. The best way to preserve them is, first of all, to remove pollution. And this works for monuments and works for people too. Anyhow, as far as damages already done, and that's what we did. The surfaces must be cleaned and cleaned rather often and lightly consolidated with some chemical ingredients, but very lightly. Most of all, they must be kept clean, because the smog, pollution activates a chemical transformation of the stone.
Are there any plans to reroute traffic around the Colosseum?
Well, traffic in the last years has been reduced near the most important marble monuments, but it's not enough, certainly. Should be done much more. I must say that one of the worst sources for pollution were heating plants, much more than cars, let's say, than automobile. And the heating plants have been changed from oil to to gas. They're no more. They don't work anymore with oil. So pollution has been reduced, but not so much, and not it's not enough.
When will the Domus Aurea be open again? Do we know?
The Domus Aurea is open.
Is it open now?
Yes, it is open.
Oh, okay. At what point in history did they realize that the Domus Aurea was, in fact, the Domus Aurea, that it wasn't just...
We already find that in the 15th century they already knew it. It was always known. As when they found it, we have in a letter of Raphael, it is called the House of Nero.
I believe there are plans to excavate the road that Mussolini drove up from the Victor Emmanuel Monument up to the Colosseum. Is that going to take place?
Well, there are plans, but it is a long process. Because, well, first of all, the subway must be built underneath the archaeological area. It goes very deep, so it doesn't ruin the monuments. And this is, there are works going on for this. We must not be impatient, because the excavation of the Roman Forum from the Capitol Hill to the Colosseum started in 1807 and finished a few years ago. So, so what we hope is that could be done, might be done in not so much such a long time, but it requires quite a time anyhow, because it implies a general transformation of the center of Rome, of the way of using the city, and unfortunately, it's not easy to do this.
It occurs to me that you are in an interesting position to think about this. Every day you deal with this incredible reach of Rome, the efficiency of the Romans, the administrative capacities, in the middle of a country, Italy, which is today thought to be chaotic, inefficient, and so forth. What happened? Or some people say that Italy is in fact extremely efficient, we just don't notice. Some people say that Italy is very efficient, just not politically efficient. But what happened? How did the people who did Rome end up in the chaotic shape they are today?
Well, as I said, greatness implies decay. That's but there is not decay without greatness, so it's it's enough. Thank you.